Launch webinar this morning for Onward's Missing Millennials report. I'm Sebastian Payne, Director of Onward, and I'm delighted to be joined by Jim Blagden, who's our Head of Data and Polling, and Charlotte Ivers, who's a columnist at the Sunday Times, to discuss the millennial generation. We're just waiting for Bima Fawami, who's written the foreword to our report, who's just having a few technical issues and will be joining us very shortly. So as some of you may have seen from the various bits of coverage, we've done this big examination of 25 to 40-year-olds and looking at why they are the first generation that are not becoming more right-wing as they get older, and what their preferences are and what this means for the Conservative Party. So we're going to start with some opening remarks. Jim's going to take us through the data and the slides, and then we're going to hear from Charlotte, and then hopefully Bim will have joined us by that point. But please do send in any questions, any areas you'd like us to dive into, and we will get going. So Jim, do you want to take through and show us through the slides and the research, and we'll take it from there?
Thanks, Seb. Happy to. I shall just share my screen. There we are. So, as Seb was saying, this is the first generation not to become more right-wing as they get older. These two graphs here are the key ones for this. On the left, we see that as millennials have aged from around 20 to around, the oldest millennials are now 40 years old, they've actually become less likely to vote for the Conservative Party. On the right, in a similar vein, you can track age groups across different general elections. And you can see that very recently, as the millennial generation have become of voting age, this younger cohort of, say, 18 to 35 have trended away from the Conservative Party and towards Labour. We wanted to understand why this is, kind of get under the surface and find out what do millennials think of the two main parties. And we can see that the Conservative brand it lies in tatters with young people, and contrast that with Labour, which does quite well amongst this younger millennial cohort. The top three traits that millennials associate with the Conservative Party are dishonest, incompetent, out of touch, also self-serving, breaks promises, divided. The brand really is in tatters. There is a silver lining to what is quite a dark cloud for the Conservatives amongst millennials, and that's the Prime Minister. He, compared to his party, polls about 25 points better among millennials, but millennials only. So we asked in our poll whether or not you have a favourable or unfavourable view of the main party leaders. And when you track this by age, as the graph here shows, 30 to 39-year-olds have some of the most favourable views of Rishi Sunak, far more than the national average. But this gap here is important. Very few intend to actually vote Conservative. And then trying to work out what their priorities are, aside from their politics, what are their concerns, what are their worries for the future, what are their top issues facing the country. And they stand out compared to the rest of the UK quite significantly. Yes, they prioritise the cost of living. Yes, they care about the NHS and the environment. But where the average person prioritises immigration and also crime, millennials are far more concerned with issues around taxation and housing. And then on the cultural side of things, we wanted to get into this question as well. Is it because millennials are radical left on cultural and social issues? The answer, roughly speaking, is no. They tend to take centre left or soft left approaches to a range of cultural issues. We see that here on the graph. But they are still fairly pro-family. They think that harmful drugs should be illegal, that violent criminals should be in prison for as long as possible, and are split on the question of immigration, although to take a liberal stance on immigration. One of the main findings that was really surprising to see in our report was was the tensions within the millennial mindset on economics. So when you ask questions on values, as we did, whether we should prioritize equality or economic growth, millennials are firmly in the equality camp. On that trade-off, they'd rather have more equality than more economic growth. But when you ask specific questions about whether we should let people keep their own money and spend it on what they choose, or redistribute to the worst off in society, millennials quite uniquely select keep my own money. So this is the kind of tension within the millennial group, is they have left-wing values but support more right-wing policies. And so to sum up, these are the main things from our poll. The millennials are not getting more conservative as they get older. This is unique and the first time it's happened. The Conservative brand is tarnished among millennials, although Labour does fairly well. Millennials like the Prime Minister. There's a huge gap between their opinion of the Conservative Party and their opinion of Rishi Sunak. Their concerns are unique to their life stage. They are much more concerned about housing and jobs and taxes. On culture, they lean soft left, but not hard left. And these cultural issues have much lower salience when it comes to voting. They're much more concerned about taxation, for instance, than social justice. And finally, millennials are shy capitalists. They have left-wing values on growth versus equality, but take right-wing stances on issues like taxation and being pro-business.
And I'm delighted that we've now got Jim has been able to join us and what you found most striking. And I do have
Right, so can everybody hear me? Great. Look, guys, it's a pleasure to be here. Sorry I was late. And the first thing that millennial MPs in Hitchin and Harpenden should do, millennials in Hitchin and Harpenden, is tell their MP to get the internet sorted. Look, I think this is a really important piece of work, because the key, there's a lot of bad, and that's been laid out clearly by Jim. But there is hope, there is optimism here. Now, look, I know I'm a politician, I'm in the optimism business, but it's true. And it's true because underpinning all of this work, when in the focus groups, in the polling, was a very strong sense that an economic message, an economic delivery was really important for these voters. Personally, I think that's something we've neglected over the last 10 years, 15 years or so, is making sure that we focus our message not on cultural questions, despite whatever, people have different views on that, but critically on the amount of money people have in their pockets, and that providing them with the opportunities to do the things they want to do for their own life, whether it be buy a house, raise a family, etc. Because unless we can deal with the economic difficulty, then I think that sort of all our other problems are sort of downstream of that. And I think that the one thing that in all the research that really stood out to me, what Jim was talking about in terms of people's preferences, what they say are their preferences, and then what their preferences actually are. And the key thing being, if it was a choice as individuals between lower taxes or what you might describe as social justice, they picked lower taxes. This is a group that is not, they're pragmatic, they're hard-headed. This should suit the modern Conservative Party with a modern Conservative leader as Rishi Sunak. And so I think that if we can develop policies focused in on this sort of group of voters, there is no reason why we can't win them back. There's no reason why we can't actually use them to be the bedrock of a Conservative majority going forward. And I actually think a lot of the problems we're seeing in the home counties more broadly is reflected in this group. So look, I think it's a really important piece of work, and I'm very happy to sort of be involved with it.
Hello, I think we've lost Seb, so I will jump straight in after Bim. I'm Charlotte, I'm a columnist at the Sunday Times. I guess I'm kind of here to add a few thoughts and reflections on the data, perhaps from a more journalistic standpoint, but also as someone who writes a fair bit in the paper about where the Conservatives are going wrong with millennials. And as well, forgive me, my voice is basically going, so if I start coughing halfway through this, then I apologise for that. But I think what we can see here is a really interesting set of data, and as Bim says, something that has a lot of opportunity for optimism within the Conservative Party. Firstly, in the short term, because you have those numbers looking really good for Rishi Sunak, but secondly as well, because you do seem to see millennials actually supporting some of the fundamental principles we would associate with the Conservative Party. So chief among them, that those numbers you've just heard about wanting to keep more of their own money rather than having it redistributed by the state. And I think the problem the Conservative Party have had so far really is short-termism. They've been looking primarily at baby boomers. Of course they have been, because the baby boomers have made up this huge percentage of the population for so long. And what I think is worth pulling out of this report is that this is changing. In 51% of seats now, you do have millennials making up the majority of voters. So that's the incentive to change something. I suppose the problem is, in many cases, even though you do see Conservative Party strategists and those at the top starting to worry about this, you do have a lot of pushback in Parliament from politicians, particularly on things like housing, because they don't want more housing in their own constituencies, which makes it very hard to get anything done. So there are sort of two problems I would diagnose, both of which are highlighted within this report. You have two reasons why anyone votes for anyone, one of which is, I like your policies, I think they'll improve my life. And the other is, you align with my values. Broadly, I feel like I feel good about myself when I vote for you, and I feel like I'm a certain type of person when I vote for you. Well, we know when it comes to values, millennials seem to think that we're a little bit more left-wing than we actually are. And so there, the challenge, I suppose, is firstly, can you break down that distinction? Secondly, as well, when the Conservative Party talks to and about millennials, is it meeting them on their own terms? And I think of some of the things that you hear from Conservative MPs about woke snowflakes, about millennials being all over cancel culture, about being hard left. And that seems like a very odd way to speak about people whose votes you want, particularly when we know that they, technically speaking, probably do agree with the Conservatives on a lot of things, but don't actually feel that at the front of their minds. That would probably be my diagnosis on that front. Then there's the other element. What do your policies actually do for me? Well, take low taxes, for example. We know that millennials like the idea they could keep more of their money. Well, if you look at something like the student loan system, my marginal tax rate is somewhere around 55p in every pound. So even if you do have millennials actually wanting Conservative policies, they don't seem to actually be getting them, whereas a pensioner on the same income as me would be on a tax rate, a marginal tax rate, significantly higher, because they don't have a student loan and they don't have national insurance. So you've kind of got these twin demons, really. You've got a values-based system whereby the Conservative Party is slightly at odds with whom millennials think they are and are doing things to exacerbate that. And then when it comes to what millennials actually believe, the Conservative Party does have a lot to offer, but isn't actually willing to offer them that at the moment. So that's probably what I would pull out of this report, but there's so much in it. So I'd be sort of interested to hear what everyone else makes of it as well, because that very much is my kind of top line summary of what that made me think about. So hopefully, I think we have Seb back, so we should be able to pass back to him for some Q&A.
Thanks very much, gang. And I'm sorry about my internet. If it does go down again, then Adam is here and ready to jump in. Bim, I just wanted to come from you if this message is getting through there. Obviously, the Conservative Party to make this vote to go. Do you think there should be on millennials right now? Will be some people in the party who say we should just focus on older people who are more like vote Conservative, and the kind of Charlotte was talking at them are going to be pretty.
I think we've entirely lost Seb, so I'm going to seamlessly jump in under my deputy director duties. And Bim, I think the question to you there was about political strategy. So the Conservative Party, as Charlotte was saying, for a while has focused on boomers, given they're both a numerical majority and traditionally have been the cohort that have been aligned with Conservative values. That strategy seems to now be reaching the end of the road. So what needs to happen now, policy-wise? What do you think the Conservative Party needs to do to correct course?
Thank you. So I'm a bit of a fanboy of Charlotte's, because she writes columns that I would love to have either thought about or written when she talks about this. And I think she was on point. There are two aspects to this. One is what you might describe fashionably. I think people talk about vibes. People talk about vibes, so the feel, the atmosphere. And the other is policy. On the feel and atmosphere, it is clear to me that unless we actually look like we like younger people, doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, but unless we actually look like we like younger people, then they are not going to like us. And the way we talk about younger people is, generally speaking, quite negative, and we do some needless things. So when it came to working from home, a lot of people in this age bracket, look, I've just turned 37. I know so many people in this age bracket, as I'm sure many people do who are on this webinar. When it comes to working from home, we sort of dismiss it and say, no, everybody needs to be in the office. Well, actually, if people have got two young kids and they're two dual earner household, working from home is the thing that a couple of days a week, however they divide that up between the mother and father, that could be really critical to keeping the family going. And yet the way we talk about it is, oh, they're all just woke lefties, Jake Berry said, woking from home, all this sort of thing. And it's sort of amusing, but what you're really saying to everybody is, we don't like your lifestyle. I think that is not a winner. Now, in policy terms, what do I think this needs to be backed up with? I argue for actually quite a radical approach on this. I think there are a few big things we could do that would show people that we were serious. First of all, Charlotte mentioned tax. National insurance, we already have differentiated rates depending on age, right? So if you're over, I think it's 60 or 65, you pay a lower rate of national insurance if you're working. I think we need to flip that round. We need to pay a lower rate if you are, say, under 40, particularly focused on those who have graduate student loans. I think actually changing national insurance for younger people to show them that we are doing something around that marginal tax rate could be a big win. And I think there has to be a significant tax cut to make a difference. Secondly, housing. Now, we can't fix the housing system today. It's very complicated and it's difficult to do. But there's one big thing the government could do. It's to build lots of houses, social housing, with a with right to buy embedded on its own land, and really make a big intervention and focus that housing deliberately on first-time buyers. That sort of thing, building a whole generation of garden cities and garden towns focused on first-time buyers. I'd also bring back Help to Buy and treble it so that you could save up to £36,000 on your deposit. The medium household in this country, the medium house is £290,000. So you'd be able to get about 10% deposit. They are the sort of practical things that I would do. And I think we need to do it before the next election.
Jim, let me come to you next on this question of kind of culture and culture wars, because there's a narrative that says, well, the big problem with this millennial cohort is they are more socially liberal, right? So they are massively turned off by the emphasis on immigration, the kind of stop the vote stuff. They are much more liberal in terms of things like identity politics, particularly around LGBT issues, that sort of thing. What evidence do you see for that in the report? You mentioned that the culture wars is something that is not necessarily activating or engaging millennials, but do the Tories need to move away from some of those messages on immigration or other areas in order to win that group back?
So we have from our poll a question which is kind of a straight question, which asks people, do you think we should talk more about economics or more about cultural issues like race and gender? And millennials, when asked that question in isolation, come out on the talk more about culture and less about economics. This is, I think, one of the main points from our poll is that's their stated preference. But when you then get under the surface and you ask in a different way, you ask people to rank the top issues they think are facing the country. Millennials pick social justice far lower down that list than issues like taxation or housing. And when we had a list of 40 potential policies across a range of economic and social issues, cutting taxes, reforming paternity leave, various things, the culture war issues around removing statues or gendered bathrooms were the bottom of that list of 40. Millennials really do not care about these things compared to other substantial issues like how much tax they pay and having a home to live in. And we see that it's not that they are anti-woke, if I can use that phrase. It's just not something they really care about. So immigration, for instance, you can ask in isolation what they think about immigration, and they give a slightly centre-left view of it. But the point is priorities. So when you ask them to trade that off against taxation or housing or job security, it comes way down the list.
Thanks, Jim. And keep your questions coming in. So you've got a couple. I'll come to those in just a second. But Charlotte, to you next. I mean, as you read this report, is it a kind of deck chairs Titanic situation in which actually the trends are too far gone now to be corrected, and we're not talking about 2024, we're talking about future elections? Or is your read of a current political situation that actually some concerted actions and delivery over the next year or so might change things?
I think it's entirely plausible that the next election could look a little bit better for the Conservatives among millennials than it does currently. I mean, basically, there's nowhere to fall. It's, 21% of millennials telling you in this report they're going to vote Conservative. And that potentially as well is something to do with that distinction we were talking about between ostensible values and actual policy preferences. So if a pollster phones you up, you're going to think, right, I'm a nice, fluffy left-wing person. I'm going to tell these guys that I hate the Conservatives. Then in the privacy of the voting booth, maybe you will be able to look at your ballot paper and think, actually, you know what, I think Keir Starmer might raise my taxes more than these guys. So I'd like to keep a bit of my own cash. Thank you very much. We don't know is the answer. And a lot of that will come down to the Labour Party and whether they can make themselves look viable and whether they can alleviate some of those classic concerns that we know voters have about Labour, which is, firstly, will they raise my taxes? And secondly, if they don't, where's the money coming from? Will they be irresponsible with the public purse? So I think part of it is out of the Conservative Party's hands. What is really positive for the Conservatives is Rishi Sunak, as you guys have rightfully flagged. And so I think it's going to be a combination of those, really. I don't think necessarily by the next election, policies-wise, the Conservatives will have much to offer millennials. But if they can emphasise Labour's flaws and big up Rishi Sunak, that could be a reasonable way to claw back a bit of success. I'm not expecting any sort of miracles here. I would say, actually, if I was a Conservative strategist, I'd be a lot more concerned about the long term than I would about the short or medium term. I think that is where those trends really start to embed, and you are just seeing that demographic change essentially mean that millennials will accrue more and more political space, and I don't see a huge amount of evidence that they are currently changing and doing the classic thing everyone's expected to do of becoming more conservative as we age.
Bim, you wanted to jump in on this point?
Yeah, this is something I maybe should have done as we were doing the research, but a question for Jim, which is how much of what we're seeing is actually not per se an issue about age, but really about graduates. So if you take graduates out, how different does the data look? And I suppose the second question following up from that is, as the country basically becomes more and more graduate and more urban, and they are the two red flags for the Conservative Party at the moment in all parts of the country, isn't this actually a more urgent problem almost than Charlotte was suggesting? You know, this could be at the next election, you'll see people in towns just really falling away from the Conservative Party, rural areas still sticking reasonably well, but the problem is towns are getting bigger and they're more and more urban areas. So yeah, just I'm wondering on those 2 points.
Go on, Jim.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Yeah.
So I think you're entirely right on the graduate thing. You can split millennials any number of ways, that cohort. And yes, you're right on graduates. They are the most what is it? Highly educated generation. And we know that graduates have in the Western world been trending towards left-wing parties for a long time. That is a problem. That's a kind of demographic problem for the Conservative Party that they will have to grapple with. We also mentioned urban density. That's also very true. You can track very much like we did with age and vote share for the two main parties. You can track urban density. You look at the population density of constituencies and how they voted over time from the 70s to now. There's a divergence where the most urban areas have become more left-wing and the most rural areas became much more right-wing, where there wasn't much of a difference before. If you look at a map of London from the 80s, Margaret Thatcher won something like 60% of London seats. That is hard to imagine today, but it did happen once. The other thing to mention this is there's caveat to this, which is that when you look at those millennials who like Rishi Sunak, but are not intending to vote Conservative, that's the side we saw with the 25-point gap in likability between the party and the PM. If you look at those voters, they are much more likely to be graduates, to live in cities, to be non-white, and to work in higher level occupations. So this like Sunak, hate the Conservative Party, is arguably the most educated, the most urban of that generation. This is where this is the complication to this. There's a lot of nuance to tease out and try and work out within millennials which segment is most amenable to voting Conservative or not.
Thanks, Jim. We could have written a whole paper on that pro-Sunak, non-Tory cohort. They're super interesting, and there is some good stuff in there in the report. I encourage people to take a look. We've got a question in on housing from Josh from Next Gen Tories. How do we get the Conservative Party to adopt policies like building more houses? Bim, you gave a fairly kind of clear sense of how we might do that, utilising public land, right to buy, etc. Give us an insight into that battle or the argument happening within the Conservative Party. There are clearly differences of views on this. Although we identified that the Prime Minister's got that boost among people in their 30s, he's quite clearly come down on, local control is important and pushed back on some of the more cavalier stuff that's come out of the Leader of the Opposition on the Green Belt. He's been quite clear in defending the existing line. Where do you think the kind of party leadership will land on this issue of house building, and how does that battle won within the Conservative Party?
So the first reason why this is difficult is there is a dispute amongst experts in the area, not MPs, but experts who study this, as to exactly why houses have become so much more unaffordable over the last 20 years. There are numerous Bank of England papers on it. In essence, broadly speaking, the consensus is about half of this is supply and about half of it is demand, right? Now, that makes this really difficult, because even if tomorrow we could say you were going to build 1 million homes every year, which I'm not saying is feasible, but say you did, and you could build that for 10 years, the impact on the house price would still be relatively modest, more modest than you think. Now, why is that? Because the people in the country who have the money to buy these houses aren't often the people who you're really intending them for. So the reason why MPs can often seem that they look two ways on this issue is they know that even if you build 5,000 homes, say in their constituency in a particular area, that isn't going to dent the house price. The person who's complaining that their son can't get on the housing ladder is still complaining. Yeah. So in essence, the debate in the party is between those that basically say, look, it doesn't matter. Even if we build 10,000 houses in my constituency in the greenfields tomorrow, it's not going to make a minus bit of difference. And then those other people who say, well, look, it may not make the entire difference, but unless we start doing it and unless we show everybody that we care, we're not going to make a difference. My view is you need to tackle the financing and the costs. And that's everything from making sure people can build up wealth to a much more supercharged Help to Buy, in addition to building more houses. But politically, and I should be careful how I say this, because I don't want to, I'm not we have to obviously be very careful. Politically, the government can be much more purposive in exactly how and where homes are built, rather than the current system, which is effectively developer-led. It's where developers want to build. The government should start to be a bit more muscular in that regard.
Thanks, Ben. Charlotte, one of the questions that's come in is about whether this kind of trend of moving more rightward as you age is actually just an outdated assumption, that in lots of countries it will cease to be true. And I guess it'd be good to get your thoughts on that, on whether there is something, these trends that we're speaking about, the kind of quotes, liberal when you're 25, conservative when you're 35, that sort of stuff, whether that's true. And a specific one thing someone's mentioned in a question on that is Brexit, about whether Brexit was a moment where that really changed. And we didn't see a lot in the poll on Brexit. We heard a bit in some of the focus groups about that being an example of something people felt frustrated about. How relevant do you think Brexit has been in disrupting what might or might not be an outdated assumption?
I think this is really interesting, and it's something I've written about before. And when you speak to pollsters, they're very reluctant to give you a commitment either way on whether we're seeing some sort of fundamental change here, or whether actually we will see all of these voters change into Conservative voters just a little bit later. So I'd say there's several different factors at stake. A lot of those pollsters did talk to me about Brexit as one of the major factors involved. I'm sort of the opinion that that probably has more of an impact on millennials of about Bim's age than of mine. I graduated the day after the referendum. I've basically never known working life without us being out of the European Union. And when I speak to people who are sort of younger than me and missed the kind of chaos of politics over the last couple of years because of that, they barely think about Brexit at all. So I wonder whether that will have an impact on Bim's cohorts, people in their 30s, but after that, it's something to worry less about. Then there's a broad cultural element, I suppose, and Brexit sort of plays into that as well, because the idea just that the Conservatives aren't for people like me, or they have conflicting values for people like me, is something you often hear. And I think Brexit could be indicative of that for a lot of older millennials, but it isn't the only factor. And that goes back to this general wokeness, culture wars type thing, which, to be fair, the leadership of the Conservative Party don't focus on that much, but you do get random drive-bys from MPs. And given most people have better things to do than follow politics constantly, it only takes a couple of random drive-bys from MPs a year, and suddenly that's the only thing that someone's seen. So that's one element, one reason as to why I think this could be sticky and not move as people age. The other one is simply that the big markers of reasons to vote Conservative and big correlates in people's lifestyles with voting Conservative, having kids, for example, or buying a house, are getting more expensive, and people are doing them much later. And so as a result of that, you would sort of expect that to push their vote later as well. Final one I'd add on that is interest rates and the general cost of borrowing. Having a nice Conservative voting lifestyle, having a nice car, foreign holidays, and a big, lovely house in the suburbs were very cheap for the last decade or so. Interest rates have been so low for so long, we've almost got used to money being free. That is now changing across the board. And I think that will particularly impact people who haven't paid off their mortgage, so likely to be younger people, people who are fairly early-ish on in their careers, people who are kids, and those all, again, are that same demographic we've been talking about.
And that Tom McTague, who spoke for us recently at one of our Future of Conservatism events, talked about kind of Dino as a electoral archetype, someone who would rely on some of that access to cheap finance in order to get on the housing ladder, etc., etc. That group feeling particularly frustrated recently. Bim, we've got a question in from Lucy, who says, looking even further forward, young people are being told in school, uni, social media that Conservatives are awful. How do we tackle that? Has that been an issue for millennials? And more broadly, there was a tweet recently from someone at the NatCon conference about the idea that young people are being indoctrinated with anti-conservative messages. Is that credible? I mean, I've got priors on that, but do you think that's the big driving problem?
I'm afraid I wasn't asked to speak at the NatCon conference. I'm still getting over my lack of invitation. But it's my view that when I did my readoption meeting for Hitchin, somebody asked me exactly this question. I'll give you the answer that I gave them, which is, it is no use complaining that people in the public sector or teachers or university lecturers or whatever are indoctrinating young people, and then at the same time not going to those institutions, reacting to that by way of saying, well, we're just not going to talk to these people. The only way you change this dynamic, and it is a bit of a dynamic, I'm not sure how prevalent it is, but it's definitely there to some degree, is by being involved, by engaging. You know, what we've got to is a very difficult position where you have particularly teachers or university lecturers there's just such an atmosphere that the Conservative Party doesn't like them and therefore they don't like us. And that definitely impacts on how they cover, how they discuss current affairs with their students. I think most teachers and lecturers are, they're professional. They're not unduly trying to indoctrinate, but it obviously comes through. So we have to be involved in these institutions. In the 70s, we used to have conservative, trade unions, for example. There was seen as a recognition that conservatives should be in the trade union movement as much as they could. I think we need to be thinking of teachers, people at universities, and say, how do we be part of this? Not just stand away and say we don't like them and they don't like us, because ultimately they are shaping a lot of people's views for the next generation.
And this the kind of importance of material concerns for that generation, right, is something that came through really clearly in the report, that when you asked me what mattered to them, it was a house, it was cheaper childcare, etc., that was most important. Jim, this shy capitalists idea that we think we've identified in the report, we think is important for political strategy. The thing you mentioned in your presentation was prioritizing equality over growth in terms of the values or vibes, but then keeping more of your income as opposed to redistributing as the policy preference. Is that just one example of this trend, or are there other things that we can point to that suggest there might be this underlying kind of centre-right set of beliefs, even if there's a centre-left veneer?
Yeah, there's a whole range of questions we asked in our poll. The one I picked out in the presentation was just one of those. You can look at the difference between their view on, millennials' view on equality versus growth as one trade-off, and lower taxes versus more distribution as a different trade-off. You can do the exact same thing with a different question on asking whether your position in society is more a result of your individual efforts or is due to factors outside your control. And millennials pick factors outside your control more than individual efforts. There's a very clear linear age trend to that. So the younger you are, the more likely you are to think your position in society is outside your control. And the older you are, the more likely you are to think it's individual effort. The difference comes when you compare that to a question on, say, whether people are pro or anti-business. Do they think that business exploits people and takes advantage? Or do they think that business provide opportunities for you to make your own way? Businesses provide opportunities and jobs and income for people. And there is a very different pattern by age on that question. Millennials are much more likely than average to say that businesses provide opportunities rather than they take advantage and exploit people. So we see again, there's a difference between their values on the effort versus outside factors question, and a more specific question on whether they think businesses are exploitative or providing opportunities. So again, there's that shy capitalist. It's quite unique amongst millennials that they are shy capitalists. There's no other age group that has that combination of views, that is left on values and right on policy.
And Charlotte, you talked about the shy Tory effect that we kind of shamelessly nicked this from or based it on, right? That people might say one thing to a pollster on the phone and another thing in the ballot box. I guess what's interesting about the shy capitalist thing is it's specifically true for millennials, that they as a cohort want to express one set of views or act on another set of preferences. Does that accord with your kind of experience, I guess, being or engaging with millennials, that actually they've got this kind of underlying pro-market tendency, even if it's not how they might want to be seen?
I would say one thing that I do find rather interesting among millennials is, firstly, Ben was just talking there about graduates, and often when you talk to Conservative MPs, the thing they'll always say they're really jealous of and annoyed about the Blair government was, firstly, that they appointed a bunch of their own ideological fellow travellers to big cultural institutions. And so the Conservatives have failed to do that for a decade and now feel like they're losing all the culture wars, probably hence are lashing out and upsetting the millennials about it. But that's a separate issue. And the second one is creating a generation of university graduates with Blair's 50% target. And I do think, obviously, university university graduation, it does correlate with being more socially liberal, often more economically left as well. So that does seem to have framed us in some ways. And I'm sort of intrigued actually by what you were saying there in that context and coming around to it in a very roundabout way, because I do think a lot of millennials have almost an instinctive suspicion of the state, which perhaps I think comes from a very extended period of crises throughout our lives. You've got the financial crash that obviously is a lot of people's first memory. You've got the Iraq War, the Chilcot inquiry as well. Then, of course, you've got COVID and the various strains and stresses that threw up on our public sector and on our public institutions. And I wonder whether that is sort of something that makes millennials come out as looking more capitalistic and more free market and more libertarian, really, because we do just have all of these things that have kept hitting us around the head and we go, I don't think I fancy more government. I don't think I fancy the government's taxing me and spending my money. I know better than them. Not necessarily come from a good place always for the governing party for the last 10 years in terms of whether this also bounces back on them, but certainly something that does seem to have appeared in this particular generation, and definitely something a party which wants a smaller state and wants to promote a smaller state could really capitalise on.
And just to follow up on that, and Bim, I'll come to you on this. One of the questions that's come in is on millennials and on the fact that they might appear more libertarian, but that's actually because of a very unique circumstance to them. And one of those unique circumstances is the extraordinarily high marginal tax rates that lots of millennials, particularly graduates, pay. And so one of the questions has been that could that apparently write on tax/economics actually because they've got the highest tax burden for decades plus student loans and they get very little for it, we use the NHS less, et cetera, et cetera. So if millennials paid as much tax as or have the same marginal tax rates as the rest of the population, might they actually fall into line on this question on tax, or do you think there's something else going on?
I think that this is really clear, actually. The difficulty for the Conservative Party is we talk about wanting to be a low tax party, and yet the marginal tax rate, as we've said, for this group is really high. So that creates a real problem in the way that Labour never talk about being a low tax party, so they don't suffer in the same way from the fact that people's marginal tax rate is high. I think this is really, really important. I can't stress this enough. Unless we are willing and find ways, I propose one way on national insurance, there'll be others. Unless we really bring down the marginal tax rate of younger graduates in particular, we have got a huge, huge problem. And as I say, there are lots of ways to skin a cat, but that needs to be an area of real focus, not just rhetorical, but actual policy focus. Because this group is getting bigger. They are becoming more relevant in terms of opinion forming. They are coming into management positions in the private sector and the public sector. And we are mad if we prioritize economically people who are less economically productive compared to this group. And I think that that's as much as an economic question as much as a political one.
I'll come back to a final question, and Charlotte, I'll come to you first, then Bim. Louise has asked, saying there's a woman newly on the Conservative candidate list, post a long career in business and education with 3 20+ children. She knows that the Conservative Party aren't offering anything to millennials, but she says she's being told to be cautious about airing views that might upset members, and is worried that means we're not putting forward honest, or the party are not putting forward honest, authentic candidates. So Charlotte, do you see prospective parliamentary candidates or Tory MPs actually reflecting the sort of messages we're talking about now? Or is there some sort of risk and tension with the membership base of the Conservative Party who skew older?
It's interesting. I do see some MPs, being here, for example, who are keen to push on this, and they tend to be the younger end of the party, but there are also some older MPs who do as well. And that being said, on the other hand, you do have some Conservative MPs who are very concerned about protecting their core base, and that in some cases an individual preference, but I'll highlight a couple of trends which I think are a bit unnerving if you are someone who wants the Conservative Party to do more for millennials. Particularly, I would look at the massive rise of the Greens and the Lib Dems in the southeast, and to a lesser extent the southwest of England. They are very much capitalising on Conservative damage there, and particularly they are capitalising on people who are concerned about house building. They are saying Conservatives are building too many houses. Think of that in our local area. Vote Lib Dem or Green in order to stop that. And that does change the makeup of local councils. But even on a national level, you do see a lot of politicians who previously were sitting on these very safe seats suddenly seeing all their votes start to flow into these parties. And that is causing them, quite reasonably, if they want to keep their jobs, to panic and to move against something like building more houses. And so that probably for me would be the force that I find most unnerving in terms of shaping the positions that politicians are taking. It takes a fairly confident politician to stand up to your voters and to your members too. I sort of know less about that size, but I can also imagine, particularly if you're on the candidates list, we know that you need to go to Conservative Party members in the last instance to get selected for a seat, and demographically speaking, they are not millennials. So why on earth would you be pitching to millennials if you want to be a Conservative MP?
Bim, on that, I mean, is there a tension between who prospective Tory parliamentary candidates need to impress and the cohorts that we're describing in this report?
I mean, I've always been very clear that I think this really matters. It's easier for me because I'm a younger politician, so I think people are more willing, older members are willing to accept it maybe a bit more easily. I think that this is really the key of this issue. There is no point having a message or a set of policies that actively turn older groups against you, because you need them, or at least a large proportion of them as well. The thing we've got to try and do here is craft a message and a policy offer that can say to the grandparent, we are helping your family, the people you love most in the world, who are your children and your grandchildren. We are helping them, and we're going to do it with your consultation. We're going to do it with your support and with your help, because you will often hear from older people, oh gosh, my son or daughter can't afford this, or they're working so hard. And, so they do recognize there is a problem as well. And so what we need to be working out over the next weeks and months is how to craft a message backed up by real policy that can bring all of these groups together. Because if you can do that, then you don't get this political problem. And to any aspirant parliamentary Tory candidates out there, what I'd say to them is, you'd be surprised how often people will disagree with an aspect of your view in a selection meeting and still vote for you. What they're looking for is passion and authenticity. So don't hold back too much, because it won't necessarily work in the way that you think.
Jim, I'm going to come to you for the final word. If you find yourself in a lift with the Prime Minister in the next couple of weeks, and you have to land the key message from this report, the thing that he needs to remember above all else, what is that one line? What does the PM, what do party strategists need to take away?
The main thing, I think, is the emphasis on the hard economics, how much tax you pay, where you live, and how much it costs to live there, and having job security and that job progression. We find millennials are actually quite aspirational and want to get ahead in life. And as much as immigration and crime are issues that the kind of 2019 coalition really care about, and therefore should not be abandoned. I think shifting a priority, if you want to safeguard the kind of coalition for the long term, shifting away from some of these things onto issues that millennials care about, family, homes, and jobs.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. Concise, excellent. We are at time. So all's left for me to say thank you so much to our panelists, to Bim, to Charlotte, to Jim. Thank you particularly to Jim for the report. The report is on the website. It's been covered extensively in the press this morning, but please do go and look at it, look at some of the graphs, the charts we've got in there. The full data set, the full poll is available for people to play around with as well. Send any questions through to Onward, but for now, thanks for joining us and hope to see you all again at another event soon.